Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and our author tonight, Dr. James Zogby, the author of Arab Voices, and the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, a Washington-based organization which serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community. Since 1985, Jim and AAI have led American Arab efforts to secure political empowerment in the United States through voter registration, education, and mobilization, and to move Arab Americans into the political mainstream. If you look at Jim's CV, he's been very personally active in politics for many years. In the 80s, he served as campaign manager and senior advisor to Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign. The DNC chairman, Don Fowler, appointed Jim as co-convener of the National Democratic Ethnic Coordinating Committee, an umbrella organization of the Democratic Party. And in 1999 to 2001, he was reelected to that post, and he was appointed to the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee and co-chair of the DNC's Resolutions Committee. So Jim, as you can see, is a very good Republican. His book, which he will expound upon, Arab Voices, What They Are Saying to Us and Why It Matters, reveals the results of this Zogby international polls conducted across a number of Arab countries. This book could not be more timely, and it addresses, in my view, one of the key challenges we have is really understanding the other, and especially understanding the culture and the people of the greater Middle East, be it the Arab world, or be it beyond into South Asia, and within the Muslim world. I had the opportunity to work in this area when then Secretary of State Colin Powell asked me to chair a advisory group on public diplomacy toward the Arab and the Muslim world. And Colin Powell, I'll never forget, he called me and he said, Congress has mandated an advisory group and they want us to answer the question, why did the Arabs hate us? And I groaned. And I said, yes. And he said, and I want you to chair this bipartisan group. I said, oh no, why did the Arabs hate us? But that was the real impetus of the congressional questioning. Why did the Arabs hate us? Why did the Muslims hate us? Jim has written a very timely and valuable book, in my mind, on the pressing need for effective public diplomacy toward the broader Middle East. The best definition of public diplomacy that I've been able to come up with is to first listen, then understand the culture and the people you're dealing with, and only then start informing, engaging, and influencing your audiences. What we Americans do very badly, we don't do those two prior steps. Listening and understanding. And I can't underscore how important that is. And I believe that it has led to very serious policy miscalculations, to say nothing about the manner in which we express ourselves and try to influence others in the framework of our national security interests. Before I ask Jim to come up, I've got to give you this quote from Winston Churchill. When I wrote my book, I really appreciated it. Churchill said, writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it is a toy, and then it is an amusement. And then it becomes a mistress. And then it becomes a master. And then it becomes a tyrant. And the last phase is that just when you are about reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster and fling him to the public. So Jim, please come and fling your book to the public.
Thank you, Ed. My wife has a simpler way of saying that. She remembered the exact period of our life when the book went from being the book to the damn book. Same basic thought. I'm here to talk to you about the damn book. Thank you, Ed, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here tonight. I have to begin, first of all, by telling you what you already know about Ed Dirigian, and that is that he was the diplomat's diplomat. They broke the mold when Ed left the Foreign Service, and I think our country would be better served today if we found a very critical role to bring Ed Dirigian back to help fix what has been broken and what has not yet been healed. Everywhere I went in the Middle East, this was a man beloved, not because he told people what they wanted to hear, but because they respected him enough to listen to what they had to hear about the message that America was sending. So the lessons you were teaching about public diplomacy were ones that you put into practice and were actually a model for, I think, the rest of us. And secondly, I'm just thrilled to be here at the Baker Institute because I'm a Democrat. There's no question I'm a Democrat. But James Baker was the last great Secretary of State of the United States of America, and I acknowledge that and revered his service to our country. The coalition he built and the way he used pressure to accomplish a vision, to put across a peace process that we are still playing off of, not having made the kind of progress that we'd be making if Jim Baker were still heading it up, was remarkable. And I think all of us as Americans owe a debt of gratitude to the kind of leadership that till this day, I have sitting in my desk, September 4th, 1990, Jim Baker's testimony before U.S. Congress. I listened to it. I was in awe of it. It was before computers, when you couldn't just easily download. I had to go to Federal News Service and pay a freaking fortune, to tell you the truth, to get him to print it up, and studied it, underlined it, and memorized lines in it because they were classic. They were classic. And the fact that he did it extemporaneously made it even more awesome and a little bit intimidating, right? Working for the guy who could just sort of be extemporaneous and speak as literate as he did. Just an amazing man. Third reason is because of this room, and I learned a lesson in this room, the U.S.-Syria dialogue that I participated in at Ed's invitation, that I want to just share with you as we begin. It's about listening. It's about listening. I came here to participate in a series of discussions with Syrian counterparts. I was on the cultural team, and there was a business team, and then there was a political team. First session was the business team, and I sort of fly on the wall listening in on the conversation. Businessmen are remarkable because business people close a deal. That's what they do, is they listen to each other because they know if they don't listen, then they're not going to get to close the deal. They're not going to know what the other guy wants or needs, and therefore they're not going to be able to sell back to him. I learned that lesson from my dad in the grocery store and watched him work customers and hear them and understand them. So even though the big supermarket opened a couple blocks away just a few years after my dad opened his business, people kept coming back to Zogby's because they liked doing business with him because he understood them. And so businessmen know how to do that, and it was a marvelous session. We then went to the political session where, as my mom would say, the fingers came out and the you word started to be said. You know, the pointing across the table, you this and you that, and people stopped listening. They were too busy, what my mom would say, jumping down the throat of the other guy. She used to chide me when I would argue with relatives. We always talked politics around my family table. And what she'd say to me was, you were starting to answer your Aunt Marie before she even finished her sentence. You didn't even know what she was going to say. And you were wrong at the top of your voice. Those were two things she always said to me. A lot of times our people in politics are like that. They don't hear what you're going to say. They've got their debate answer ready before they've even heard what you're saying. And so they're not talking with you, they're talking at you. and they're too busy finding fault and blaming, and they therefore can't close the deal. I've often said that if our politicians did politics the way our businessmen do business, we might do something. But if our businessmen did business the way our politicians do politics, we'd all be poor. And so there is a lesson I learned here that I've applied in my work, and that is the need to listen. The need, as my mom would say, to hear what the other guys say so that he'll be able to listen to you. Because if you don't hear him first, then there's no way that you're going to be able to say to him what's on his mind, respond to the concerns he has, because you have no idea what he's thinking. You know what you're thinking, and you're interpreting his feeling, but you don't really know it. I therefore came into this book after 30-something years of full-time work in this field, in this region, PhD, travel almost monthly to the Middle East, poll for the last 15 years in the Middle East, read a weekly column in 20 papers, TV show that's a call-in show that Ed Dirigen's done with me a number of times, where we take phone calls from across the region, and I get a feel for what they're thinking and what we don't know that they're thinking. And I was troubled by this enormous disconnect. The myths we had about the Arab world and the reality that it was, what President Obama said, the Arab reality as opposed to the imagined reality that we operate with most of the time. I wanted to deal with that. I wanted to deal with it in a concise and convenient enough way that would help sort of move the public discussion forward. I begin the treatment with a couple of data points. The first is that we're invested in the Middle East. For those who think we just write it off and forget it, I put it this way. Since the end of Vietnam, and this actually has been true now for almost 20 years, since the end of Vietnam, we have sent more money, we've sent more weapons, we've sent more troops, we've fought more wars, we have lost more lives. We have more national security interests at stake and more allies at risk in the Middle East than anywhere else in the world, and we've expended more political capital. The presidency of every U.S. president since the end of Vietnam has in some significant way been determined, success or failure, by what they have done in or about the Middle East. And so with the enormity of that investment and those interests, with the consequences that accrue to us from what is at stake, it is tragic how little we know about the region. Just some simple numbers from our polling. Asked Americans in 2009, about a third were able to identify where Iraq was on the map. That's after losing 4,400 people. Now, that's better than when, in 2003, when we went into Iraq, and only 11% could find it on a map. That only a third of Americans know the year that Israel declared its independence. That 60% of Americans think Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey are Arab countries, don't know the difference and don't care, don't think it matters. And one could go on and on, actually, with a number of issues like that. The fact is, we don't know. Why don't we know? Well, if you look at the studies that have been done by MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, or the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the level of our education is abysmally low. And when your Texas Board of Education just passed a resolution a little less than a month ago to dumb it down even further because too much emphasis on Islam, and it was sort of polluting the knowledge of students. The fact is that we know too little and we're knowing less all the time. 2,400 colleges and universities studied, four-year colleges and universities studied. Only 360 of them offer the Arabic language. Of them, only 60 have Middle East studies programs that offer degrees. Only 2,400 students in Arabic language programs at a level sufficient to produce proficiency. Less than 1% of high school students studying Arabic anywhere in the country at this point in time. We know too little. And our education doesn't prepare us to know anymore. After 9/11, Chicago Council on Global Affairs was commissioned to do a study in the public schools, and they interviewed teachers and students. What they found was that students were asking all the right questions, but teachers couldn't answer them because their education had not prepared them. And teachers didn't even know where to look to find the resources to use to answer the questions. And in any case, what the teachers did know was largely born of prejudice or bias because their ideas of the Middle East were shaped not by their learning, which they didn't get, but were shaped rather by the media culture, the popular culture, the political culture, and the myths that shared by everybody else. So when you ask the question, Congress says, why do they hate us? It's part of the great myth. But it is a myth that is shared generally by the public and by our teachers, and therefore that was what they were teaching. And the students couldn't get anything more because there was nothing being offered. You begin with this baseline of we just don't know, and then you add to it the popular culture, which goes beyond the not knowing and projects on the not knowing negative stereotypes. I did a study for the major networks a couple of decades ago, and actually the situation has not changed significantly since, in which we looked at all of the entertainment programming on the ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was all there was at the time. It's actually, there's more, but the quality's actually gotten worse, but that's another issue for another day. And what we found was that there were 260 something Arabs portrayed in the 5.5-year period covered in our study. When we looked at all of these 260-something characters, they broke into two categories, terrorist or oil sheikh, nothing in between. There wasn't a single average Joe, not just a regular Arab. There was no good guy, but there was no average guy. They were bad uniformly, but of two types. When we went to the networks and argued the case with them, made the point that the problem is that if you're doing a Jewish character, a negative stereotype, or you're doing an African American, a negative stereotype, you have in your overall programming other characters that people can then put it into a picture and say, well, I know that some black people are like that, or some Jews are like that, or some Hispanics are like that. But you know, there's this other set of characters, and they complete the picture. Are there Arab terrorists? Of course there are. Are there Arab oil sheikhs? Of course there are. And who do contemptible things? Of course. But when the president says, and the billions of peace-loving Muslims, can any of us get an image of that in our head? Have we seen those billions of peace? The answer is no, because in our popular culture, they don't get conveyed. And so the result is that we're stuck with the stereotypes defining the reality that our education did not provide us with any information to counter. The political culture doesn't help either. I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, that Congress doesn't understand, but if you look at the congressional debates and look at the congressional and listen to what they do, think of Park 51. I mean, it started as a discussion about should you build a mosque in a particular place, but quickly devolved into an Islamophobic attack on the religion of 1.5 billion people. The stuff that Newt Gingrich said, shame. I looked at the stuff he said, and interestingly enough, New York Times 2 Sundays ago did a 2 full-page feature of a woman, Pam Geller. Now, you don't know who Pam Geller is. You may not. You may know who she is. She's a blogger. She's a blogger who writes a popular blog on the far right called Atlas Shrugged. And she proudly calls herself an Islamophobic bigot. That's what she calls herself. And she is pleased with that. And the article, which turned out to be more of a puff piece, it was about this abrasive, aggressive, tough, nasty woman, no holds barred, gets into the fight and is not afraid to call herself a bigot. I thought to myself, if there were a Muslim guy and he called himself proudly an anti-Semitic bigot, would he get 2 full pages in the New York Times? Unless it was like a wanted poster? I mean, would we even have the ability to do that? or the interest in doing that? And would Newt Gingrich end up quoting that person? Actually, his talking points on the attack on Park 51 came from a self-avowed Islamophobic bigot. And he wants to be president of the United States? I mean, but that shaped the debate. And we had candidates across the country mimicking those lines and now taking out television ads in Iowa or in West Virginia. In a congressional district, unemployment is 13.5%, and they just had a terrible tragedy with miners dying. And the one candidate's attacking the other because he didn't attack the Park 51 mosque. He defended the right of Muslims to build a mosque and the victory mosque that is the declaration of war against the American people. That's what you're running on in West Virginia these days. Not jobs, not the economy, not mine safety, but the Muslims want to build a mosque in New York. And so if you put that on top of the myths in the popular culture, you have real damage being done to the public perception and the public understanding of who we're talking about and what we're talking about. Add to that the commentators that form the sort of the media culture. I mean, I get called to do a debate on CNN about Iraq, and they say, you'll be on with Bill Bennett. And I say, what? What's he got to say about Iraq? What does he know about Iraq? And yet, the number of times that Ed or I or people like us will get called to do this stuff is minuscule compared to the talking heads who do it every single day and do a grave injustice to the American people. I'm a Democrat, but MSNBC gives me a royal pain. And Fox gives me an even greater royal pain. And CNN gives me an even greater royal pain because it's dumb. The fact is you got 3 major news networks who do damage to our understanding of issues because they've got the best political teams who interpret all reality for us, even if they themselves do not know it. And what it amounts to, in the case of every one of them, is echo chambers for a popular culture which they happen to read that morning in the newspaper. And they form their talking points and they go on television, and you then have Carvel and Begala and Bennett and whatever, Republicans, Democrats alike, talking about things they knew very little about, but shaping the thinking of most of us about what those realities are. I'm sorry, but it does a damage to who we are. That is why we went into Iraq without asking questions, because they answered the questions for us before we even had a chance to mouth them. I have in the book, I quote a number of them. Bill Kristol, well, it's just pop culture that the Sunni and Shia won't get along. People who say that don't know what they're talking about. No, Bill Kristol, you don't know what you're talking about. And we're living that one out. But you know what's interesting is that you look at the book and look at all of the quotes that I have that led us into the war. 6 days it's over, 6 months we'll be out. And think to yourself, if we took television commentators and graded them, gave them batting averages, for example, how many of them would stay in the majors? I mean, they'd not only be down in the minors, but they'd have their contracts suspended. And they'd be out, and nobody ever would pick them up again. But there is no accountability in the media for not knowing. I got called one time, after 9/11, Fox used to call me a lot. And they called me one time, this is the last time actually I got called. They called and say, would you come on, we want to talk about Afghanistan. And I said, I don't do Afghanistan. The girl laughed. She said, you what? I said, I don't do Afghanistan. She said, nobody ever says that to us. They just come on. And I said, I'm sorry, but you call it silly, but I don't talk about things I don't know about. It's like sort of a thing with me. And she said to me, she said, most guys just pick up the newspaper and then come on and talk about it. And we don't want you on anyhow as an expert, but we think you're a really good talker in these debates. That's what they want, is entertainment. But they led us into a war that was entertainment, and it wasn't funny. And it's still with us. And we still don't know any more about Iraq today. Average American people don't know anything more about Iraq today than we knew when we went in. Still don't understand. I mean, it got to the point where if you knew 5 words in Arabic and could put 2 in a sentence, madrasa and Sunni. Let me see, Sunni extremists and madrasas. Or, if you could do two, you were really good. And you were therefore qualified as a television commentator on these critical issues. Put all that together, and the ignorance was compounded by something more dangerous than not knowing, and that is thinking that you do know. In our polling, we used to get 75% of the American people telling us, I don't know enough and need to know more. The numbers dropped down to 59% right now, and that 16% is a precipitous drop of people who think they know because they have been informed by the popular or media or political culture. Not a good situation. Based on all of that, 5 great myths emerged about the Arab world, and I cover each of them in the book. And I just want to walk through a couple of them with you. The first one is that they're all the same, which allows us to do things like use a book, Raphael Patai's The Arab Mind, to teach U.S. military officials. I mean, that book was a standard book used by U.S. military in Iraq to teach about Arab culture. The fact is that there is no Arab mind. I don't mean that they are mindless. I mean that there is no single Arab mind. It is not a they. The kind of in the question I get on the radio show, well, how can you say that about them when you know that they all hate us and that they do this and I saw them dancing in the streets? And some people are like this and some people are like that. We know enough when talking about ourselves to understand our diversity and to understand the uniqueness of each individual and even the groups among us, that there are some of us are like this and some of us are like that. So what we do to counter that myth is I do polling. I love polling because polling is a respectful science. We interview 4,000 people in 6 countries. We've been doing it, not the same 4,000, a random gathering, a random selection of 4,000 people. We've been doing it twice a year now for over a decade. And what we do is we listen to everyone and respect what they say. And then we organize the data and we categorize it. We categorize it by country, by gender, by age, by education. And then we produce the results and we present them. And we see that no, all Arabs do not think alike. All Arabs do not feel alike. All Arabs have wildly different views on a number of issues and concerns. And that the unique culture and the mix of Morocco, its Berber and its Arab and its French, create a very different environment than Cairo or Egypt. Again, wildly different than Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And still very different than Amman or with its Palestinian and Jordanian Bedouin mix and its British background. I mean, the fact is that each of these places have a unique set of components that shape them and therefore can't all be reduced to a them and can't all be suggested to be, as Bernard Lewis might, an Arab monolith, a monochromatic, stale, dark, dreary place that has no joy and creates nothing of worth. That notion of them is one of the myths that we have. The second is a sort of a version of that, a twist on it. It's that, okay, they're all so different that they don't really exist as a world at all. There's no such thing as the Arabs. And that's equally damaging and equally false. Fact is, there is an Arab world. And it is a common culture, a language that, while there are differences, just as there are differences from the Southies in Boston to the southern people in southwest Texas to the folks who live in southwest LA, but there are some common threads that unite us as a people. We saw that after 9/11. In tragedy, we come together. In many instances, we come together as a people and define ourselves as a community that has enough in the way of a common set of issues and interests and concerns to make us a people. It's the same thing in the Arab world. When we ask people in Morocco or UAE why Iraq bothers them, they say, because it's happening to a people who are like me, which is pretty much the answer they give us about Palestine. A minister in the UAE called me and told me, she said he said that when he saw what was happening in Gaza, he said, I looked at those kids and they could be mine. They looked like my kids, and it broke his heart. In some ways, I look at like the American Jewish community and I look at the Holocaust. What happened in the Arab world is not a Holocaust. Do not think I'm saying that. I mean, I understand the difference between 6 million people slaughtered and 100,000 people. I'm not creating moral equivalency. People get antsy about that and attack me for it. That's not the case. But what is the case is that in the same way that American Jews saw the Holocaust and felt deeply over something that happened to people like them, and it made them feel vulnerable, and it made them feel a sense of loss of control, and it gave them a renewed sense of identity. That same sense of thematic plays out in the Arab culture. So when we ask people about how important Palestine is to them, it's very important, not as a foreign policy question. It's important to them as an existential personal issue of a people like them who are hurting and over whom they have no ability to do what they want to do to help. And so a sense of reminding them of powerlessness, of being out of history, out of control, of a vulnerability, of all of those things that bring them together. So we say there is no Arab world, there is no commonality. We can kind of isolate this issue. We go into Iraq, and the Bush administration used both, actually. It was a weird sort of disconnect. On the one hand, they said, we'll go into Iraq, overthrow the dictator, create a democracy, and it'll spread throughout the whole Middle East. On the other hand, they said, what we do in Iraq won't have an impact on Morocco. And it wasn't true. Both, on the one hand, they were different enough that no, the war in Iraq did not spread across the Middle East, other than chaos spread and resentment spread. But on the other hand, it was not isolatable to one place. You could not let Israel demolish Gaza and assume that no one was going to feel a darn thing about that next door or 1,000 miles away, because it resonated. The third of the myths is the notion that they're all angry. And I am reminded of a next-door neighbor of mine when I lived in southwest Pennsylvania. He was I'd lived in Philly for many, many years and went to Temple, got my PhD, and did postdoctoral work there, and then moved out to this little town, Carlisle, sometimes best known as where the Redskins used to have their summer camp. But it's and Jim Thorpe was from there. And U.S. Army has the War College was there. But it was a wonderful little town. My next-door neighbor eyed me suspiciously for a couple of weeks, and then finally came over to see me, and he said, I just got to ask you something. And I said, yes. And he said, you lived there? And I said, yes, I did. He said, you and your family lived there? I had 2 kids at the time. I said, yes. And you weren't afraid? I said, well, no, not really. Why? He said, they're murdering people there every day. I read it in the paper. And sure enough, he got the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was the paper of record across most of the state in Pennsylvania, and people read it, and sure enough, every day there was a murder reported in Philadelphia. Now, 3.5 million people in the greater Philadelphia metropolitan area, and so there was probably some violent crime there almost every day. But the issue is that did not define daily life in Philadelphia. Nor did a terrorist attack in Egypt, here or there, define daily life in Egypt. In fact, it's safer to live in Egypt, in Cairo, than it is to live in Miami Beach. Less people get killed. There's less violent crime. Streets are safer. People are happier. Well, happy? Oh, I saw pictures of those people demonstrating with their fists and the anger. Yeah, I know. That's the only picture you saw. There's 20-something million people living in Greater Cairo. They aren't all fists in the air and angry and muscles strained in the neck and eyes bulging. That's not the story. Terry Jones does not define America. Neither did the demonstrators at Park 51. I was at a press conference the day before Terry Jones was to burn that Quran. And it was the heads of the Council of Churches and the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference and 5 major Jewish religious organizations and 3 African American church groupings And the Orthodox churches, the Armenian and the Greek, and passing a 2.5-hour debate and a resolution against bigotry and intolerance. We went into a press conference right next room. There were 100 reporters there, 75 television cameras. Next day, it got scant mention in the press, almost no mention at all, almost none. The entire story was Terry Jones. Now, if you were somebody living in the Arab world, you'd get the sense all those Americans are like that Terry Jones guy, and they're all crazy. Or they're all like that Newt Gingrich guy and those demonstrators, they want to destroy Islam. I was just with all the religious organization heads in America, speaking for their communities, not believing that. No press coverage. So some wacko with a beard living in a cave in Afghanistan issues a video cassette, or now he doesn't even do that, he does a little audio cassette, which I still think is remarkable. He's probably got one of the last ones around. I'm surprised sometimes the network get that audio cassette and they say, you got one of these? What do we do with this one? The day will come when he's going to put himself out of business because nobody's going to know what to do with it. Then he'll upgrade to an 8-track, and then they'll be scrambling around looking for how to play it. What do we do with it? But he does that, and he's the Terry Jones in terms of the support base. Now, Terry Jones has some supporters. There's no question. There's no question that there are some crazy people in America who are extremists and fundamentalists and whatever. And Osama bin Laden is the same. And I do not want to dismiss for a minute that he's dangerous. He is dangerous. And he can be a problem. And he is a threat. And he has threatened and harmed our people. He does not define Arab reality. And when we poll, we discover the degree to which he does not define that reality. And so the numbers convey a different sense. They convey an Arab world that does not go to bed at night hating America, wake up in the morning hating Israel, and spend the entire day watching Al Jazeera and getting even angrier. Or going to a mosque and listening to an imam. Church attendance rates in America and mosque attendance rates in the Arab world are about the same. We rank television shows. We interview people across the board. Religious programming, 7th out of 8th. Less than 10% in most countries. People that watch them at all. Number 1 rated shows are movies, and then dramas and soap operas and reality shows. People watch television to be entertained. And their number 1 political concerns are not being angry. It's, interestingly enough, it's the economy, and then it's healthcare, and then it's education. Sounding familiar here, folks? They're like us. They care they go to bed at night worried about their kids. They wake up in the morning thinking about their jobs, and they spend the day hoping they don't get sick and hoping they can provide and that their kids can have a better life than they. They're like people everywhere around the world. And the fact is that what the book tries to do is establish that as an important counter to the myths that give us a sense that we know them, but that we see them through this prism of a stereotype that defines them. The other myths are that they're all fanatic or that they're all backwards, and they are just as wrong as the first 3. I conclude then that the myths are a problem, but not just because they communicate to us and define a misperception of a region, but because they've led us into foreign policy blunders, that we've not understood them to be blunders until we're too far in and can't get out. Iraq was one. Palestine and the way we've handled that and the lack of balance, the fact that we've only seen one narrative and not understood 2 narratives and the need to reconcile them both as essential for there to be peace. And the way we've handled Lebanon and the misunderstanding we've had of the demographics and the population and the fragileness of that democracy. And the way we've handled reform, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, that we failed to understand the degree to which we had become damaged goods. And that the country that made war, I was debating with somebody last night who'd written a book about how democracies don't make war, And in the Arab world, that one doesn't wash anymore. That one doesn't wash. After Iraq and after a number of wars with Israel, that one doesn't wash anymore. And and I tell you, one of the things, my lasting regret and my shame as an American was, as somebody who has served on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch and has, because I have a certain amount of credibility in the Arab world, and have gone and challenged them in public fora and in private meetings on their human rights record, have chided the Egyptians on their abuse of rights. And then to have at a press conference an Egyptian foreign minister point me out in the audience and say, "And what do you say to me now when your country's doing worse than we ever did?" Hurts me as an American that we're no longer Ronald Reagan's city on the hill, that we have lost that ability to project democracy and to project freedom and the rights of others and accountability and transparency and due process. And all the issues that defined us conceptually, we stopped putting into practice. And so we made a mess of reform. And I have a chapter as well on Arab Americans, which I think it's my community. I tried to write that. This is the hardest chapter to write, Ed, because I didn't want to have it come off like a long whine, because whining isn't politics. It's just therapy. And this was not therapy, but it was a look at an underused resource and how America has not used Arab Americans because they've not recognized the role they could play as a valuable asset in projecting our diplomacy and our values overseas. After looking at the myths and why we've got them, and then looking at the blunders we've made, I try to end on a positive note because I think that there's a lot there to talk about. I start with 2 chapters called Getting It Right. And the first chapter, Getting It Right, is what government's doing to get it right. And I start with where I need to start, and that's the president's speech in Cairo, which I think was a remarkable roadmap. He got it right. He understood all the issues that divided us, understood the mistakes we'd made, understood where we had to go, but also understood, as he notes toward the end of his speech, that one speech isn't going to change it. We had to deliver and follow through. And there we've been lacking. And I want to be clear that we know where we got to go, but getting to where we got to go is a different story. But the roadmap is still as valuable as it was when he first delivered it. And I look at that in pieces and as a whole, in terms of the lessons that it teaches. I go beyond the president into the programs. I remember when I first started getting involved in kind of debating with AID some of the programs they did. They used to be like the little boy who wanted to walk the old lady across the street and she didn't want to go. I mean, they were like, I used to argue we should have demand-driven foreign aid, and instead what we had was guys sitting in the bowels of the agency and thinking, 75 million, I know what we'll do. We'll spend it this way. Then they award a contract to an American contractor who's got zero experience, who's then, I'll tell you a story, true story. During the Clinton administration, I was asked by Vice President Gore to head up a project with a former congressman that supported economic growth in the West Bank, and in that capacity, I chaired the session in Casablanca on the Palestinian economy at the first economic summit that brought Israelis and Arabs together. It was a remarkable moment for the Israelis and for the Arabs, and the Palestinians in particular. I chaired the session with 3 Palestinian ministers, and at the end of the session, a 31-year-old guy comes up and he says, could you introduce me to some of the ministers? And he was so eager, I said, why? And he said, because I'm the guy that just got the AID contract for $9.3 million to teach entrepreneurialism to Palestinians in the West Bank. And I thought, Palestinians don't need to learn entrepreneurialism. They actually give them 2 nickels and they open a business with it. And he said, would you introduce me? So I went over and told the ministers, and they were beside themselves. They said, this is the 75 million that we're getting, the U.S. foreign aid. They've programmed it all away without talking to us. They never asked us what we wanted. There's a mistake that most people have. The only foreign aid that actually gets given to a country is foreign aid to Israel. They actually get a check up front in toto, the beginning of the calendar, the beginning of the fiscal year. It gets transferred into their account and they collect interest on it, even if they don't use it. All the other aid goes to AID. And then AID then programs it out through proposals that largely go to American contractors. They proudly say that about 80-something%, 80 cents on the dollar, gets spent here on American contractors. This kid, 31-year-old, his only job before that had been 7 years working at AID. And now he'd graduated to getting an AID contract to provide Palestinians with something they didn't want, didn't ask for, couldn't use, even if they did want it. And that sense of our aid program, fundamentally flawed, but it has now changed. And I am proud to say that actually during the Bush administration in the second term, I had a number of heart-to-heart talks about that with Karen Hughes. She actually made a significant contribution to our public diplomacy, not by the way she projected herself, but by the way she transformed programs and made the programs more demand-driven and partnership. And that's been continued now in this administration. When Mrs. Clinton announced the last round of programs out in Morocco at the G8, they were all partnership programs. All of them were partnership programs. When the president convened the Entrepreneurial Summit, it was all based on partnership. The notion is that we would find partners, work with partners, and we would together develop these programs to make change, giving people what they wanted and what they needed that we had the expertise to help them with. And in the polling that we do, we know what Arabs want. We also know when we ask them the question, what do you want America to help you with? They do not want us to help them with democracy. They do not want us to help them with women's rights. That would be the same as if during the healthcare debate, the Swedes had said, we know how to do this. Or if the Brits had come over during our gun control debate and said, oh, little cousin, let us help you figure this out. We don't have the kind of handgun problem that you do. We would resent it. And they resent us telling them how to govern themselves. But they know, and the polling is very sophisticated in this regard. The answers are sophisticated. They know what we can do. They know we can help them improve their education. They know we can help them improve their health care delivery. They know we can help them with job creation. They know we can help them with science and technology advances. They don't want us meddling in their internal affairs. They want to build capacity in their countries so that they can change on their own. And those are the programs we're doing right now, and so I have to acknowledge what we're doing to get it right. Then there are these little gems all through the government that I really want to point out and people need to know, like CIPE, the Center for Investment in Private Enterprise. It's run by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's the grant-making body that they've created to help grow free markets in the private sector around the world. And then there's the role of American corporations. In the years when our public diplomacy stunk, the best public diplomacy being done was by our corporations. I spoke one time to the international board of Starbucks in the Middle East, and I said, you guys are saving lives every day. Because when people come into Starbucks to buy a cup of coffee in Bahrain or in Kuwait or in Jordan, they're not coming there because the coffee's better than the local fare. They're coming because it's America, and they want to buy a little piece of America. That's why they eat at Burger King or Pizza Hut or McDonald's. It's not because the food's better. Kentucky Fried Chicken is nothing to write home about, here or there. But it is a little piece of America, and it gives people a sense that they're participating in something that they really like. One of the guys I interview in the book tells me, he said, the difference between you guys and the Germans and the Japanese and the Chinese, the other great exporting nations, is they export products. You export a way of life. And it's a way of life that we all want to buy into. And that's the valuable thing we do, and that's what our corporations are doing every day. I mean, the good news is that when we poll in the Arab world and we ask attitudes towards America, American people, the America attitudes are low. The numbers of attitude toward American policy are abysmally low. But attitude toward American people and products are very high. It's the thing that holds us up. And people who know Americans have even more favorable attitude than those who don't, which is good, because if it were the reverse, we'd be in real trouble. Real trouble. And I look at some universities doing it right, and I look at some NGOs doing it right. I talk about programs that are just wonderful, wonderful programs being run around the country. The World Affairs Councils and the Great Decision Series run by the Foreign Policy Association, or the Model Arab League that you participated in, that is just marvelous, providing young people across the country a chance to learn about an Arab country and immerse themselves in that. And if I'd known and met you guys before, the students here, before I wrote the book, I would have put you in the book for the stuff you're doing and for what you couple guys did in Cairo this summer, and the way you want to expand that, bringing 10 students from here to meet with students in Cairo and to immerse each other in each other's culture. I mean, you ought to be proud of these kids. They are public diplomats helping to change the image of America overseas in a significant way. Thank you. Then I end with what everyday average folks can do. And I have a resource guide in the end of the book and talk about the things you can do at home and how you can go online and learn about places and people and read daily newspapers. It's marvelous that every Arab country now has an Arabic newspaper translated into English, or an existing English language newspaper that in many cases is one of the better papers in their country. You can't get a better paper in Beirut than the Daily Star, or in Jordan than the Jordan Times, or the National or Gulf News in the UAE. I mean, these are first-class newspapers, and you can read them every day, and you can comment on articles, and you can engage in conversation as people respond to your comments. And by immersing yourself in that way, you can actually change the way you think, change the way you feel, and become a citizen diplomat yourself. So I'm throwing this dead dinosaur out at you. Or what my wife calls the dead book, the damn book. It's not a dead book yet. The dread fear of any author is to go into what used to be Marlboros and finding it on the remainder table for $1.25, right? That's the dread fear. There's one stereotype about Arabs, though, that's true. My dad was a grocer, and I'm the son of a Lebanese merchant. And I'm here to sell you books. And it's in my blood. And I'd be happy to take your questions, but I'd be even happier to sell you some books. And close the doors and nobody gets out till you bought one.
Jim will allow, if you have a question, please come up to one of the two mics there, and we'll take a few questions. And then the books are here, courtesy of Brazos Bookstore, and our author will sign the books there right after the Q today. So please, if you have a question, come up to the microphone, identify yourself in this.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm Ron Young. I'm a gynecologist from across the street. If you look at mafia movies, there's a set piece that occurs in every other mafia movie, the stare down, in which the protagonist is staring across at his gangster antagonist, and he says, "Who am I talking to? Am I talking to you? Am I talking to you?" He wants to find out who has the power, who he's talking to.
Yeah.
So that's a problem we have. I mean, you have implied that there are deficiency gaps in American knowledge of history. But one thing we do know is that there are numerous examples of dedicated minorities, vicious and energized, who are not only willing to kill for their ideals, but to die for them, who have had enormous success in taking over governments and bringing tremendous harm to their own people and others around them. That happened twice in the last century. And there are numerous examples of religions, whole religions being hijacked, like in the Crusades, where fanatics hijacked an entire religion and did immeasurable harm to themselves and others around them. So what are you telling us about these terrorists, the so-called, not Islam, but Islamists? I would suggest that you're probably preaching to the choir here. Probably virtually everyone here shares most of your attitudes about most of the
Does that mean they won't buy the book? I'm sorry, I'm just...
No, they should buy the book.
That's right,
I'm
to
sure
reinforce those attitudes,
I'm sure the
yes.
book is wonderful.
Yeah.
But whose problem is it?
Yeah.
Should we ignore the problem? There are random bombings, so someone gets the airplane next time or gets Times Square next time or does something even worse. We can't really ignore them. Whose problem is it if it's not our problem? Is it their problem that they have to solve it themselves, or is it our problem, or is it joint problem in the world? I mean, we know that most Muslims are peace-loving, probably 99%. That's the question. This problem is...
I'm getting the point, and listen, it's an incredibly thoughtful question, and it is actually, and I don't mean this flippantly, it's the next book. It's the public policy book of what do you do now that you know. A little story. I spent my most formative experience in a refugee camp in Lebanon in 1971 doing dissertation research, interviewing refugees and getting their stories down. At that point, they were still fairly fresh in their minds. 48 to 71 was not that long, and so many of the people I talked to were in just their first generation out of Palestine. The stories were profound and moving, and I still have the notebooks. As I left the camp after 3 weeks, the grandmother of the young man who had taken me around and who she herself had introduced me to many of the folks that I'd interviewed, grabbed my arm and she stared me in the eye and she said, "We've told you everything we know. What are you going to do?" And here's what happened. I write about this in the book because one of the things that happens when you listen is you do come to understand. But what also happens to you when you listen is it gives you a responsibility. You have to do something about it. You're like the little old lady grabbing me in the arm right now and saying, "Okay, I get it. Now what do I do?" The book takes me so far. It takes me to the point, and you're right, it's for those who don't know, who don't understand that what we're saying is that those guys making the bomb in the basement, or those guys preaching in the mosque, or those guys who are leading this movement here or there. I want people to know that is a minority. That does not define daily life. And that if you treat the minority as if it were the majority, there are consequences. And the consequences are that you end up fueling that extremism and creating a bigger problem in each of those countries and a problem for America. What I don't do in the book is provide a prescription for what do we do then about that tiny minority and how do we deal with it. I have ideas, obviously, about what we can do about it. But the first thing is to, I guess I'd go back to the old saw, is dry up the swamp, is remove the possible bases of support that they have, some of which is based on bitterness and resentment and anger, some of which is based on grievances, some real and some imagined, but many of them, most of them real, that have to do with, to some extent, failures and mistakes of our policy and policies of our allies. And so I do look at that in some ways, but it is not a book of, it's not a prescription about policy. It's about Arab voices, and it's about what they're saying to us and why it's important that we listen to them. That's the point. But thank you, and it is I think it's an important thing that's going to stick with me. I thank you, sir. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Ahmed Solomon. I came from Iraq the first year John F. Kennedy was President of the United States. And unlike you, I've been a Republican even before I became a U.S. citizen. And if you go to my 1964 yearbook, you will find out in there that I was campaigning for Barry Goldwater.
Well, can I tell you something? I actually campaigned for Barry Goldwater too, and I was president of the Young Republican Club, but I got older and wiser, and I matured as I went along, and things happen.
I am still the same Republican.
Well, I'm not.
I stick to the old conservative Republican parties of, eras of Eisenhower, and
right.
Who was the tallest man probably ever walked into the White House. But unlike, you're a Democrat and you care a lot about James Baker, I'm a Republican. I really don't have the same feeling that you do. Because right now, they just issued yesterday, his counterpart, Iraqi counterpart, Tariq Aziz, who met with James Baker just a couple of weeks before U.S. started the apocalypse in Iraq. And U.S. just hand him over. They want him hanged. and they will within the next 30 days, is going to be hanged. And I believe Tariq Aziz has a lot less blood on his hand than James Baker. And I believe that you should do at most your ability or talk to the congressman and senator to save that man's life.
Well, let me tell you that I was shocked when I saw the announcement about Tariq Aziz getting the death penalty. He is somebody certainly who has been complicitous in policies that I think were destructive to the Iraqi people, but also to beyond the Iraqi people. But I do think that he is not himself personally as guilty of the crimes that some of the others who were found guilty are. I think that there are degrees here of guilt. And I also know that within this country, the Chaldean community that I feel very close to, the Chaldean Christian community, and he himself is Chaldean Christian, feel very strongly that he is being unfairly treated in this regard. And I do know that there are people who will raise that issue. I don't know what ability the United States has at this point. I'm afraid we've lost a lot of leverage in Iraq in the ability to shape the outcome. It would be, I think it would be a miscarriage of justice. I must tell you that as a Democrat, I'm not only a Democrat, but I'm a weird pro-life Democrat. Maybe it's the sort of the hangover of some of I am a Catholic, a Maronite Catholic. I oppose the death penalty. I'm a Colonel Bernardine believer in the seamless web of life, and I therefore don't like the death penalty to begin with, but in this case it is, I believe, unwarranted. I agree with you, and I saw the story just when you saw it and felt I needed to think about where to go with that. I also want to talk to my Chaldean friends and the leadership of that community to see what they're doing about it, because I know they're going to be bothered as well. But thank you for raising that.
So my question, could it be that they want him executed because he's the last one left that has all the trade agreements with the United States?
I don't know.
And the chemical weapons and everything?
I don't know.
Because he knows it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Islamophobia is even more pronounced in certain countries in Europe today than it is in the U.S. We know with the large immigrant population there. What do you see as the differences and solutions in Europe versus what is going on in the U.S.?
I do a lot of speaking in Europe, I used to anyway, when I felt we had credibility to do so. I'm not sure I would want to go over there these days after Park 51. But I'd presented a paper in Prague in 2005, I think it was, and then was invited to talk about the same thing in Berlin and Warsaw and London. And my paper was called The Difference, and it was about, and I write about it in the book, the difference, who we are versus who they are. I was in a debate with the secretary of Merkel's national security cabinet, and she was going on about the migrants. If they want to be German, we can let them be German, but they must become German, and they're migrants, and it was going on, and I said, wait, I know these people. They've been there for 3 generations. When did they stop being migrants? Or in London, when I was in London, and they just had the election, and they were proudly boasting at this session I was at that 23 members of the new parliament were immigrants. And I know some of these people. They're third generation Pakistanis living in London. But the difference between America and England and France and Germany has always been that. My dad came here, and within 5 years after qualifying, he actually came undocumented, as many did back then for reasons we can talk about later. But after 5 years of qualifying, he became a citizen and didn't just get a passport, but he became an American. Every bit as much an American as somebody who came over on the Mayflower. And if the bigots among them didn't get it, they would be quickly reminded of the fact that his rights and theirs were equal. That defined us. When I went to school and studied Washington crossing the Delaware, it was like I was on the boat with him. And when Lewis and Clark were on the frontier, I went with them, and I was at the Alamo with Davy Crockett. It was like, it was my story. The narrative as it's told is our collective story. We all share in it. But you can be 3 generations in Germany, and you're still a migrant, and you're still a Turk. Or 3 generations in Algeria, and you're still an Algerian in France, and you're still an Arab. Or 3 generations Pakistani in London, and you're still a Paki. You never become British. You never become French. You never become German in the real sense. And that has always been the difference. That is what protected us. And what Park 51 is threatening to do is say to a generation of young Muslims in America, you will never be one of us. You will always be the outsider. And if we create that kind of alienation, the consequences will be grave. And what bothered me a little bit about that debate was that at the end of the day, the good guy side of it was the Constitution. And I'm sorry, I love the Constitution too, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was the essence of who we are as a people was at stake. That's what was at stake in that issue. And so we always had, and when I found out that the Homeland Security people were going to London to study how they dealt with I said, you're nuts. We don't go to them to learn how to deal with immigrants. They should be coming to us. When have they ever been masters at dealing with that problem? Never figured it out, ever, ever. I mean, Europe does not know how to deal even with Europeans migrating. I mean, 3rd generation Polish plumber living in London will never be a Brit. But a 1st generation Pole in America becomes an American. I mean, to me, we don't understand, not only them, we don't understand our own story and the greatness of who we are. So anyway, sorry, but I think it's in the book. I talk about that a lot, and I feel very strongly about it. Yes?
This will be the last question.
What are your thoughts about the recent comments by Don Williams on the Fox commentator?
Juan Williams.
Juan Williams.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, you know, I've been asked this question almost everywhere, and I break it into 2 parts. One is how he got fired, and I'm not going to comment on that because I can't. I don't care enough to get into that part of it. But what he said was deplorable. What he said was stupid. And try this. Politico, which is a website, one of the more popular and famous political websites, asked me to do a comment on it. And I thought about it, and instead of doing a comment, I did the following. I took exactly what Juan Williams said, exactly what he said, and where the word Muslim was there, I took it out and I put Jew in. And then I did it again, and I took out Muslim and I put in black. And I said, does it sound awful? Does it make you wince? Then don't say it. And when I needed to go even further, and they said, one of the debates I was in on one of the radio shows, the guy said, but he was just expressing his feelings, and he was just talking about his feelings. And I said, you do that with your shrink. The point is that it's not either edifying and it's insulting. And I said, for example, what if he had said, using exactly the same phrasing, I don't know about you, but when I see Lola, the secretary, in that tight skirt, it does something to me, and it go on in the same way. Would he say that on radio or television? Should he say that on radio or television? Is that political correctness? No. My mom used to use an expression, filter. Filter. Not everything that comes into your head do you say. When it is hurtful or insulting to other people, you just don't say it. Now, we've gone from Howard Stern to Bill O'Reilly, and we've lost that edge. We don't know at this point what is simply the term my mom used to use, just not edifying. You know? And the fact is that we've so cheapened the discourse that's what's happened. So what he said was stupid, it was deplorable, I condemn it, it never should have been said. It is not political correctness, it's just being smart. And he was not smart. And it's not the first time he was being dumb. But I can't comment on whether or not NPR did the right thing because I'm not part of their administration. Thank Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jim will sign the books over here. Please, they're here to be purchased, and then you can sign
Any
them
question
there.
you've got, I'll take while I'm signing.
Right.